Welcome to High Quality Podcast Action. My name is Nick. His name is
I'm
John.
John.
He tends to just interrupt me and give interesting input from time to time.
Yeah, that's the point.
Right.
Point of the podcast.
Thank you for correcting me. So
You're welcome.
this past week we've had a fair amount of stuff happening. Even just today, a lot of stuff happening. Trump's pulling out of a nuclear deal. There's a caravan of Central Americans coming to the border to seek
There are
greener
bombs
pastures. Yes,
being sent to
By
elected
bombs.
officials and liberal. I guess he's a heavy donator.
Oh, George Soros. Yeah,
Yeah,
you could say that. He's their boogeyman. He's funding the deep state for any kind of activity that.
so he's a lizard person.
Yeah, he's part of the right wing conspiracy. I mean, he is a
Makes
billionaire who just donate. It's not like he's infallible, but
Yeah,
they're trying to make him out to be like the guy. Bernie Sanders always talks about the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson. But George Soros is our Koch brother and Sheldon Adelson.
yeah. I suppose I don't know if I would call him ours, but
No,
that's just-
according to them, they're trying to
Yeah.
create an equivalency. Anyway,
they
but-
lump all of the moderate liberals in with everybody else on the left-hand side of the aisle, as it were.
yeah.
Anyway, since we're on that topic, why don't we just jump into it? We had what, 4 supposed pipe bombs sent to George Soros.
Let's count them out. So we
We're
got
just discussing.
Soros, Clinton, Obama. One was supposed to be sent to Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, but
And CNN, maybe?
so
I feel like there was either CNN or like the New York Times, some news agency had one sent or ended up there.
So that envelope was addressed to Jack Brennan, but it was mailed to the CNN headquarters in New York.
Right.
The one
Yeah.
that was sent to Eric Holder, I guess the address was incorrect, so it got returned to the return address, which was Debbie Wasserman Schultz's office in Florida. And every single parcel had Debbie Wasserman Schultz's name and address on it. I mean, the name was misspelled, but
Sure.
everything else was okay. And I'm missing Maxine Waters received one
The
too.
bombs that were sent to the Obamas and Clintons were intercepted by
The Secret Service, yep.
Secret Service before they actually ended up there.
So none of them, I think, except CNN, actually ended up, being near their intended targets.
Didn't Soros's? Or was that
No, not
like
even
left on
his.
the end of his driveway or something?
I'm not sure if the
Yeah.
full story is there because I couldn't find it. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm just not that. Maybe I've lost my touch in investigative.
Well, it also may be a slight bit of misinformation because I did see a couple of, like the AP had a tweet about the bombs being sent or delivered to the Clintons when in fact they weren't delivered, and that tweet and story got rescinded after they found out that they hadn't been delivered but were supposed to be delivered to them but were intercepted by Secret Service.
Right.
So some weird bit of misinformation from journalists either jumping on things too quickly or someone reporting on it not having their facts put together before trying to report some breaking news.
Yeah.
In any event, I
I-
think we can agree that the whole thing is a bit disturbing and also hard to understand why someone would feel such a need to send implemented explosive devices to anyone.
I mean,
let
it's,
alone
it's terrorism.
Yeah, I
Flat
mean,
out. You're sending an
it's
explosive
domestic
device,
terrorism. It literally is.
Oh, we
It
don't
doesn't
know.
matter who sent it.
Right. To touch on this caravan real quick, this is so what I don't think people understand, they just see a caravan, they say caravans, a couple thousand people. But the reason that they're even in that a mass amount of people for two main reasons. One, when they go in like much smaller groups of people, it is not unheard of, and there have been cases where people have been kidnapped. So if you have strength in numbers there, chances of getting kidnapped are not as good. And two, the Mexican government, it's not like people are fleeing Mexico per se. That's not to say no Mexicans are going over the border. But from Central America, countries like Guatemala and Honduras, they're coming across into Mexico illegally as well. And if you're coming as 7,000, I think that's what the number I could find was 7,000 people. 7,000 people crossing at one time, it's infinitely harder for any kind of security personnel to deal with your illegal crossing too. So the reason there's that many people at once is for those two main reasons. And I'm sure somewhere in there, George Soros is, paying them to walk thousands of miles in heat just to come to America to vote Democrat.
Yeah, he's sponsoring them like people in a marathon, right?
Totally. Yep. Yeah. I think I saw people cheering and filling water cups at tables. I think.
They were offering those stroopwafels and other snacks along the way.
Oh, delicious. I don't run, but those are pretty good.
They're fantastic. either with like coffee, tea, hot chocolate, anything, or just by themselves. They're delicious. Highly recommended.
Oh yeah, for sure. Wish I had one right now.
Oh, if we could be sponsored by Stroopwafels,
yes,
please.
We're plugging in already, so we're way ahead of the curve.
Every podcast from now on will have some Stroopwafels plug, maybe.
So the other, I think this is the third piece of big news, is that Trump is pulling out of the INF treaty.
Yep.
Saying that Russia has violated the treaty. John Bolton said it was outdated, which I don't, if you look at what's in the treaty, like what was negotiated in 1987, there's nothing in there that is outdated. Like, it cannot become outdated. It just said it was going to dismantle these weapons, and then they had this, decades long back and forth saying that, these new missiles that you're building break this treaty because it wasn't written in there initially.
Right. It's not a hard definition of the particular missiles that we're now seeing in development by like Russia for a hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missile, which I don't think the US is developing, or at least we don't know about anything they're developing. But in terms of calling it not outdated, I don't know that that's entirely true, because one of the reasons that came up in terms of why we would even be looking at pulling out of the agreement is, one, like you mentioned, Russia is supposedly violating it, which you could argue based on how they've been deploying missiles in proximity to NATO countries and European countries.
Well, the head of NATO,
and also
the head of NATO even said that they were violating that treaty.
Right, and they've had the NATO designation for the missile is the SSC-8 or the RK-55, which is the Russian designation for the missiles. And it's a mobile launch platform that has up to 6, I think between 4 and 6 missiles on it that are medium range ballistic missiles that each have probably like at least 3 warheads on each one. And they can move and set up and launch in like under 10 minutes. So it's one of those things where they can set them up on a border of Russia or near a European country on the border of Russia and have them ready to go to fire on whoever, whether that be, a European country or on the eastern side of Russia where they could fire on Japan, or Guam where the US might be, or something like that. But the other reason that Trump or the Trump administration is pulling out of this existing INF agreement is down to China not being involved or not a signee of the agreement, and still having developed something like 2,000 or 2,200 weapons since they've been capable of developing ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons.
But I mean, does it make sense to pull out of that completely? Like, you would think if you want to renegotiate things for modern weaponry and to have China in a new treaty, that you would do that without pulling out of the old one, or at least amending it, trying to bring China on board. I mean, I don't think China would go for it personally. I
Well,
mean,
no.
I mean, he keeps blaming them for stuff that they, haven't done to the
Yeah.
election interference and BS like that.
And slapping tariffs on them for aluminum and steel to try
Right.
and spur growth in American economy. Yeah, whatever.
So they can say whatever they want because I think that's utter not. I think that's utter nonsense to me.
I don't disagree with you. I think that pulling out full stop of the agreement is a bit ham-handed, to say the least.
I mean, Putin came out and said that he completely disagreed with it, which I've found a little strange because you would think if there was one country who would benefit most from that would be Russia.
Right.
But he, I need to find the exact quote of what he told the media today because it was very. It didn't contradict what Trump and Bolton had said, but it was definitely kind of not the response you were expecting from him.
Uncharacteristic of
Yeah.
their great leader in Russia.
Here we go. When asked what Trump would do, or I'm sorry, when asked what Russia would do if Trump made good on his pledge to leave the treaty, Putin said, "We can and it will be very fast and very effective. If the United States does withdraw from the INF treaty, the main question is what they will do with these intermediate range missiles that will once again appear. If they will deliver them to Europe, naturally our response will have to mirror this, and European countries that agreed to host them, if things go that far, must understand that they are putting their own territory at risk of a possible counterstrike." So essentially, he's calling Trump's bluff because I'm not 100% sure, but from what Putin is saying, he thinks, or it sounds like, U.S. missiles are stored in EU countries.
Yeah. I think he's alluding to the fact that anti-missile batteries that the U.S. has in place in like Germany and those areas that are owned or operated by, I guess you could say they have oversight from the German military, but they are U.S. missile batteries. Those could be used to fire offensive weapons like a medium-range ballistic missile at Russia. Now, there's no proof as to whether the U.S. has ballistic missiles there, but Germany certainly has possession of some U.S. ballistic missiles. I don't know if those are air or land-based, but if they were land-based, they would be covered by the INF. If they were air or sea-based weapons, they wouldn't be covered by the INF. Because essentially the INF is putting into place limits on the number of missiles that any of the two signed countries, Russia and the US, can have control of or operational from, like, I think it's down to 1,550 or something. It was around there.
Sounds about right.
And those missiles the controlled missiles are those that have a range between 300 and 3,400 miles. But it doesn't cover air-based missiles, air-based weapons or sea-launched weapons. So like all of the submarines that the US and Russia have, where they have all of their submarine-launched ballistic missiles of range, I don't know off the top of my head, but those are left out of the treaty. So this really only concerns kind of land control to a certain extent, which again is where China comes in, because the US doesn't have a means of keeping China from expanding their sphere of influence in terms of control with nuclear weapons capabilities. Because the closest that the US can get to China is Guam. And that's a tiny spit of land in comparison to what China has in terms of land-based capabilities for setting up to potentially have a battery of ballistic missiles that could fire on Japan or Indo-China area, the eastern side of like the Philippines and that kind of region. So it comes down to a battle of trying to control areas of interest to all parties involved, and specifically the US. But
So-
again, just jumping out of the treaty completely is not the greatest route to go about renegotiating if that's the end goal, or trying to be hard on China or Russia. It's not a great strategy in my opinion.
This is that behavior I think he kind of gets from his creepy business practices, because, at his core, he's a con man, flat out. So I think in his little mind, he can just, not, if he wants to stop doing something, he's just not going to do it anymore. Thank you for doing, all this work. I'm not going to pay you. Thank you for signing this treaty, but I didn't sign it initially, so I'm just going to pull right out of it.
And to add to that, he criticized Obama of not pulling out of it already. So of course he's going to try and act and say, "Oh, well, look what I did. I pulled out of it like Obama should have. Look at me."
Yeah, but I don't think that was ever an interest in for Obama to even renegotiate anything. I know wasn't there a second treaty called START. I don't know what's a part of that.
New START is a renegotiation of the START treaty, and I think the dates for those are like 91 was when the first START, and then START 2 was in 94 or 95.
So these aren't recently at all.
No, but New START was in this year, or like last couple years, because the US and Russia just announced this year in February that they had met the regulations for the New START treaty. And New START stands for New Strategic Arms Treaty. And what that does is it limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550. It limits deployed ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, sub-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers, which each count as a single warhead unto themselves, down to 700, which it was at almost twice that. So 1,500, 1,400, 1,500 in the previous agreement. And that deployed, and then the deployed and non-deployed total limit is set at 800. So that non-deployed means test launchers and extra bombers that might not be actively involved in the fleet, but are grounded for whatever reason, be it maintenance or test of the equipment and systems. But it doesn't limit non-deployed ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, but it does monitor them. So it serves as kind of a different control of the strategic weapons, as opposed to the INF, which is more about the control of land-based and cruise-based, mid-range ballistic missiles, essentially serving the purpose of limiting how many missiles of a certain range can be set up in Europe or in Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That whole kind of interaction is meant to be regulated by the INF, whereas the New START serves as a more overarching regulation of nuclear arms.
Well, all this, talk about arms and, maybe even potential wars is really scary. It kind of makes you want to a drink of some sort.
I have just the thing, and it's called beer.
Whoa!
That
Tell me
wonderful
more.
weekly segment where I tell you about a beer that I'm drinking.
We need to come up with a little
Unceremoniously,
ditty or something to introduce it, Nick.
if I had time to write a jingle, maybe.
I mean, maybe my little, every transition I've made for it, I think has been perfect. So maybe we'll just keep it at that.
I can't disagree with you there. It was a solid transition. So
I
anyway,
try. So what are you drinking?
this week, I am imbibing a Treg's beer that is called Master of Pumpkins.
Master!
Nod to
Master!
Metallica.
Master
It's
of
their-
pumpkins, you pulling the string! Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the if you couldn't guess by the name, it's a pumpkin beer, which I've had in the past,
I ascertained that, yeah.
and this one is definitely better than the previous one that I had. If you want to go back and listen and figure out which one that was, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Was it
but-
that IPA one? I don't.
No, I don't think so. I think it was just
It's
some
not important.
pumpkin ale. It might have been a Dogfish Head pumpkin ale. In any event, this is much better. In terms of pumpkininess, it tastes marginally like pumpkin, as it should, but it is definitely more of a spiced beer than it is a pumpkin beer. It's got a lot of good cinnamon and ginger and clove notes, your standard pumpkin spice bits in there, but it also has hints of vanilla and a nice smooth malty character to it. It also comes in one of those fancy corked topped bottles,
What the?
but not a gigantic one of those. It's easily had in a single serving glass.
Where do you
And
find this stuff?
It's kind of got a little bit of saison characteristic to it as well. I think they use yeast from a French saison beer, which is kind of like a end of summer beer, farmhouse ale. If you're familiar with that particular strain of beers, they have a little bit of kind of an intermediate flavor compared to like a summery beer that would be really light and full of citrus flavor or things like that, tied in with like a more malty kind of malty and caramel tasting fall beer that's a little bit darker and kind of ties the two together. So I would give it a solid 4 out of 5
Whoa.
on a rating scale,
Whoa.
and would recommend it to anybody who's looking for a fall-esque beer.
If beer is not your fancy in trying times, perhaps not promoting illegal activities at all, but perhaps marijuana is something you may be more apt to consume.
Myself,
And-
no, but
I
Others
mean, me
possibly.
neither. So, obviously, other international news up north. On October 17th, Canada became the second country in the world after Uruguay to legalize cannabis for all uses.
and Cheetos sales went through the roof.
That's right, dude. Doritos, Cheetos. If it ends in Edo, everybody just bought it up.
Snack mix in general.
Full legalization in Canada has brought unparalleled access to money for basic research on cannabis, which I've always been about because I think it's one plant that has so many properties that we have not researched because it is still illegal.
Taboo.
So Canada has 129 licensed cannabis producers, and they are all clamoring to work with scientists on everything from gene mapping, metabolic engineering, optimal drying techniques, different growing practices, anything you can think of. And as a part of this effort to corner the global legal cannabis market, federal and provincial governments in Canada are putting up millions of dollars to support research because the cannabis market, conservatively, is forecast to top 57 billion US dollars within the decade.
Good God.
A lot of money.
If only the U.S. had some foresight to do that on a more massive scale like Canada.
Nah. So why is this important? As I said before, I think that, I'll kind of explain why we're kind of behind the ball on uses for cannabis. Some researchers are well prepared to take advantage of this legalization. But botanists of all stripes are now turning to the plant for both funding opportunities and uncharted science. So who would have thought that weed may be the savior for some plant scientist funding? So Ernest Small, a botanist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, who has studied cannabis off and on since 1971, said, "You're talking about a plant that's a century out of date in terms of modern breeding techniques and scientific development." Let me explain why that is with a few examples. For researchers, it's not just medical research, it's the agricultural stuff I've mentioned. There just is not the same research into breeding cannabis plants like there is for other mass-produced crops like wheat or corn. So what?
Or grapes.
Grapes.
I mean, hey, I'm just thinking Cornell. I get newsletters about new varieties of grapes that have been developed by Cornell scientists because
true.
Wine country.
Same kind of principle.
Yeah.
So what breeding or agricultural? I don't know why I'm tripping up over the word agricultural so much. So what breeding or agricultural techniques
there you go.
Do we currently have that researchers can apply to and then can apply to cannabis that's been applied to other plants? So one method involves scientists mating plants and coaxing them to produce seeds and then exposing those seeds to chemical mutagens, which is a fancy way of saying genetically modified, in hopes of finding new desirable traits such as resistance to pests or increased tolerance to environmental stresses such as drought or other extreme weather. Another decades-old practice involves intentionally doubling or tripling a plant's genome, and that tends to give plant cells tends to give plants bigger cells, larger structural features, and greater yields of their chemical compounds. Something that obviously one of the big reasons you want to look at weed is because of the chemical compounds present in it.
CBD being chief of those, and
yes,
THC as well, but.
And we've done the same thing with domesticated plants for a very long time. We've done it with wheat species. We've copied the genome 4 to 6 times in some species of wheat. Sugarcane, the same thing, all the way up to 16 copies of sugarcane genome. But the difficulty with that method is that those plants had their DNA multiplied through hundreds of years of cultivation. Wheat doesn't have that. We don't have 100 years of cultivation nowhere near the scale of crops like that. But there are ways to speed up this process, and essentially all cannabis varieties characterized so far have only 2 sets of the genome. So scientists use a cell cycle disrupting herbicide to trigger 5 varieties of cannabis to double their normal chromosome count. The plants that grew from this method were bigger. Scientists still need to finish their analysis to determine whether these cannabis plants do have elevated levels of cannabinoids such as CBD. So stay tuned to see if the plants with larger genomes yield higher chemical compounds. A more modern plant breeding technique called marker-assisted selection involves finding the genetic signatures associated with a desirable trait. So in cannabis, that could be high essential oil content, content or automatic flowering under any sort of light condition, which could be important when you live in Canada where there seems like there's no sunlight during the winter. But instead of having to wait months for plants to mature, scientists can use DNA analysis to quickly preview which seedlings should have those optimal properties. Researchers have not taken a hard look at what markers exist on cannabis. Just to give you an example of just how far behind cannabis research is, one marker that has been described comes from George Weiblin, a plant biologist at the University of Minnesota in St. Paul. Don't know anyone who lives near there. And one of the few academics in the U.S. who has a federal license to grow cannabis. But he was restricted to just 50 plants at a time. And it took him 12 years to determine the inheritance pattern of genes that affect drug content and to identify a genetic marker linked to the THC to CBD ratio. To give you a picture of just how long 12 years really is, Gregor Mendel worked out the laws of heredity in less time. And that was a larger scope of work. So we're a little behind the 8 ball on that.
Yeah, just a bit.
Yikes. A complete cannabis genome would, make it a lot easier to identify informative DNA markers, but we do not yet have a complete cannabis genome. Hopefully that'll change thanks to this legalization in Canada, but also internationally there's a trend towards having less restrictive laws about cannabis, and even many companies that grow weed are now investing in genetics research. I mean, there's already been 6 companies who grow weed that say there's 6 companies that said they have come up with fine-scale genome maps, but they have not been published in a peer-reviewed journal, which just means no one else has been able to recreate the genome. That does not prevent them from making the genome maps public, though. I don't know why that is. Here's a non-peer-reviewed genome map.
Or making claims that they have had a successful genome mapping for whatever particular strain or variety of cannabis they happen to be marketing.
So with those techniques in mind, how will scientists apply all that? Well, there are scientists who are hoping to engineer new properties into cannabis plants. There is work in development to develop a gene silencing technology that prevents the expression of the THC synthesis gene. So the expectation is that cannabis plants would compensate by boosting their levels of CBD, or could potentially produce other cannabinoids that the world doesn't even know about yet. So we could have a cannabinoid that doesn't exist yet. Whoa. It could be something that makes you higher, who knows?
Maybe. Not that I care.
Dream hard, man. But that hypothesis has yet to be fully tested because they have yet to grow full-fledged plants from genetically modified tissue. That is actually fairly common at the moment due to not being able to genetically modify seeds or clippings in a consistent or predictable way. And that issue is still being researched on how to more consistently and predictably genetically modify plant tissue. Researchers are also looking to control and fine-tune environmental conditions at various stages of the growth cycle. More controlled conditions can make growing cannabis even more profitable. Give you an example, the fans found in most companies' grow rooms move air over the plant crowns, but in the thicket of leaves and branches beneath, the air remains stagnant. This causes pockets of elevated temperature and humidity, which in turn breed fungal pathogens. The solution to that is fairly simple. Add a pressure gradient from floor to ceiling that ensures airflow along every surface of the plant. So, who says innovation has to be complicated? I know we're talking about a lot of gene splicing and crazy stuff like that here, but, a pressure gradient, that's pretty easy to do. Don't need a whole lot of money and research there. Deron Kaplan, director of plant science at Flower in Lake Country, completed a
Appropriately named.
Completed a PhD this year in which he systematically determined optimal rates of fertilizer supply at various stages of cannabis production and the best practices for propagating genetically identical plants through cuttings. Mike Dixon, who is an agricultural scientist at the University of Guelph and one of Kaplan's graduate advisors, said it's very crude incremental advancements that we're making, but it's slowly helping to phase out the homespun practices that persist throughout much of the industry, what I kindly refer to as anecdotal bullshit. So for many in the industry, there's some taboo. Any suggestion of genetic modification is an anathema, the argument being that modern selective breeding strategies should suffice, and those methods do not need and do not require genetic markers. Chemical profiling has been used to create dozens of cannabis varieties with unique properties and elevated yields. And it's kind of funny when I was researching this subject behind the future of cannabis research. So some of the growers who, were growing things illegally for a while are now coming out of the woodwork and joining these, or even starting their own research centers. Like, when else would you see something like this happen? Like something that's been illegal, and all of a sudden, all the criminals come out to help. Hey, let me help you research this a bit more. Like, I can't think of a time that anything like this has happened or would happen.
Hey, if the money's good,
oh, it's good.
It'll go.
So
Progress will occur. Thanks, capitalism.
That's the spiel about what weed legalization means in Canada, and that's just Canada alone. So we'll see if other countries kind of catch up.
Yeah, if we follow suit in that, I think it would be beneficial. But who knows with how things progress?
Yeah, I think we're still a little far out. I feel like maybe when you and I are like 70 years old, maybe.
If we're lucky. So,
right.
speaking of weed and getting high, there's
where is this going?
Does this name sound like someone who would get high on the regular? Bepi Colombo.
Oh, dude, he sounds like, a real badass drug dealer, I'm Bepi Colombo. They always come after me. Scarface was based on my life.
He sounds like he could definitely be a mobster.
Gangster style.
In some Al Pacino film.
And yet...
But no. He is not.
What?
He's a spacecraft.
A space...
Or, well, a spacecraft that's named after an Italian physicist.
Does it sell weed?
No?
Did the Italian physicist it was named after sell weed?
Also no?
Okay.
And I can't attest to the validity of whether or not Bepi Colombo sold weed, but
anyway,
Bepi Colombo we're talking about is, in fact, a European Space Agency and Japanese Space Agency combined effort to send a spacecraft, technically two spacecraft or two instrument spacecraft, to Mercury, the first planet in our solar system, which is no small feat, as going toward the sun and establishing a stable orbit around a planet is a little bit more tricky than going away from the sun and, say, going to the moon to orbit the moon.
Yeah, when I was looking into kind of the history of space travel, or not space travel, of exploration. We've only visited, I'll put that in quotes, we've only visited Mercury 2 times prior.
Yep.
Mariner 10 launched 1973. The mission ended in 1975. Didn't actually reach Mercury's orbit. I think it made 2 flybys before it ran out of fuel for thrusters. When they were sending it commands, they noticed that the trajectory had gone off course, so that indicated that it was pretty much done for. So they turned the antenna off. We haven't heard from it since it went silent in 1975, and its fate is not known. We haven't observed it. Don't know what happened to it. Doesn't look like it crashed into the planet. It could just be orbiting the sun right now for all we know. So Mariner 10, if you're out there, we are thinking of you.
Godspeed. The
second probe, Messenger, which was named after Mercury, because Mercury was the fast messenger, as you may know. The depiction of Mercury has wings on his feet. So,
yep.
Because the planet looked like it moved really fast, so that's why they called it after Mercury. So, anyways, Messenger launched in 2004, and it reached Mercury in about the same time frame for its first flyby, but it did not enter Mercury's orbit until 2011. Now, you may be saying, WTF? Why do more recent missions take so darn long to get to Mercury? And like you said, because it's going towards the sun, it requires so much speed to get to the planet and get to its orbit that we just don't have the propulsion system to really overcome it. It's not like going to Mars or sending Voyager, New Horizon way out there. You have to compete with a much stronger force that we can't overcome. So the way that we do that is with gravity. And the reason it takes so long is because they're called gravity assists that we get from planets take quite a long time. You have to time up the orbit around the planet precisely, and it could take up to a year from gravity assist to gravity assist, from flyby to flyby of a planet. So the reason that it's going to take 7 years from its launch date to reach Mercury's orbit is because of that issue.
And that's not even taking into account the more years following that where it will establish a stable orbit around Mercury.
Right.
Yeah.
So by using these gravity assists, it slows down its speed enough for it to not necessarily ignore the sun's gravitational pull, but be able to not have it, command it so much. So it'll be the first time we've established a stable orbit with Mercury, or at least as stable as we can get. Messenger's orbit wasn't perfectly stable either. Messenger's fate we know about. They crashed it into Mercury, and it did make a small crater about the size of a basketball court. So technically, I guess we could observe where Messenger crashed, but Mariner 10, we don't know.
It's gone forever.
So Bepi Colombo, at a cost of $1.8 billion US, 1.6 billion euros, like we said, will reach Mercury's orbit by 2025. But that is after several flybys of Earth, Venus, and Mercury itself. So what that means is that when you pass the planet, and you come close enough to observe it, that counts as a flyby. It lasts a few days before the gravity assist happens and the probe goes around another orbit around the sun. So Bepi Colombo will make 1 flyby of Earth, 2 flybys of Venus, and then 6 flybys of Mercury before arriving in Mercury's orbit December 5th of 2025. So mark your calendars on that.
Yep. Pay attention. Now, that being said, it's not going to just bypass Venus and Mercury on its initial gravity assist
No,
slowdown.
no. It will be doing
It will be
hard
taking
scenes.
data as it passes by, data and photos, as it passes by both Venus and Mercury on its trajectory to its final orbit around the first rock from the sun. And I think it's just worth noting that how interesting the process of gravity assist can be to both speed up and slow down objects.
Oh, yeah. If
We use gravity assists for almost all of our robotic spacecraft that go to Saturn or Jupiter or Uranus and Neptune in the future, and with New Horizons in the last few years going to Pluto, there were a lot of instances of gravity assist with those. I think New Horizons maybe New Horizons was the only one that just literally used rocket power to send it as fast as possible. Or did it use Jupiter?
New Horizon did use Jupiter, but it didn't use any other planet for gravity assist.
That would make sense. Jupiter being a massive gravity assist.
Yeah.
But in any event, the other interesting fact about Bepi Colombo, aside from its 2 spacecraft construction, which we'll get to in a minute, is that it does have thrusters, but not your regular thrusters that most of us are familiar with in terms of reaction thrusters, or essentially small little rocket thrusters that give out puffs of smoke at strategic moments to change orientation. No, it has ion thrusters.
What?
Which
do tell
are set up as a electric propulsion system that allow for there are 4 of them on this particular spacecraft that allow for a more reduced weight, in the sense that they only really need solar panels and the ion thruster itself, and they use the acceleration of ions through this particular thruster arrangement to propel the spacecraft in a manner. Normally, if you're going away from the sun, they would propel the spacecraft at an infinite amount to bring it up to a certain speed. In this case, they're still doing that, but they are using that speed to assist in the propulsion and reduction in weight, so that then the gravity assists can help to slow the spacecraft down and all of that. So the thing to note about these in terms of space travel is thrust is not as a important factor as specific impulse is. So
what is specific impulse?
That's a great question. I don't know. Specific impulse. No, specific impulse is it's essentially a measure of how effectively a rocket, or a thruster in this case, uses a propellant as fuel. So for a rocket, like a general rocket would be pretty damn efficient compared to like a turbofan that would have a higher specific impulse, because it is not as efficient as a rocket is. So with these, so like as a comparison, we'll say a turbofan has a specific impulse of like 6,000, and these thrusters on Bepi Colombo have a specific impulse of about 4,000, whereas a rocket engine would have a specific impulse of sub 1,000 ish. I think the like SpaceX thrusters on their new spacecraft have a specific impulse of like 300 or something like that. I may be way off. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but
educated guess.
The thrust of these ion thrusters is about that exerted by the weight of a sheet of writing paper, or just like an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. But they can fire for months at a time. So if you think of that sheet of paper being multiplied every minute or whatever, every few seconds for months at a time, you got a lot of sheets of paper that can weigh quite a lot and
Yeah.
thereby give you a really high specific impulse. So they're very effective and are honestly the future of one of the future's propulsion methods for spacecraft of this type, robotic exploration, and the like.
If you want to
But moving
see
on,
just how crazy the orbital path is
oh
of
yeah,
Bepi Colombo,
it's a bit
ESA
ridiculous.
has a video of it on YouTube. I'll just put Bepi Colombo trajectory or something into YouTube and just watch how long this thing will travel. I'll get to some numbers here momentarily, but when I'm watching this video and I'm looking at the clock in the top left, it's counting days like they're milliseconds. So this thing's relative to time as we experience it on Earth. It's moving what seems like really slow, but in reality, it's not. Some quick numbers for you. So 7 years after launch from Earth, it will finally have reached its destination of Mercury's orbit. Bepi Colombo will travel a total distance of 9 billion kilometers, or 5.6 billion miles. It will take up to 13 minutes for a one-way signal between the probe and Earth. The fastest speed the probe will reach is 60 kilometers per second, or 37 miles per second. The maximum distance the probe will be from Earth is 240 million kilometers, or 149 million miles. And the Mercury probe will experience a temperature range, the Mercury probe can withstand and will experience a temperature range of between negative 180 degrees Celsius up to 450 degrees Celsius. And that equates to negative 292 Fahrenheit and 842 Fahrenheit. So quite a range and quite a lot of impressive numbers there, I must say, for this mission.
Yeah.
The two probes, just real quick, I don't know if you were going to say more about what they do, but just a
quick overview. There
Yeah.
are two of the orbiters, the Mercury Planetary Orbiter, or the MPO, and the MIO, or the Mercury Magnetospheric Orbiter.
I think Japan made one and ESA made the other.
Yes. So as the Magnetospheric Orbiter implies, made by Japan primarily, it will orbit around Mercury and serve to map and take data on the magnetosphere of Mercury. Being closest to the sun, the magnetosphere of Mercury has some interesting properties that we aren't fully aware of, and similarly to the magnetosphere measurements of Jupiter and Saturn, which are unique in their own particular ways, Mercury serves to give us another idea of what a planet very close to its star could have for a magnetic field that would experience the greatest amount of solar wind and other particles associated with that solar wind and those effects on its magnetosphere. Whereas the Mercury Planetary Orbiter has a payload of 11 instruments that comprise cameras, spectrometers for X-rays, gamma rays, neutrons, etc., radiometer, laser altimeter, magnetometer, particle analyzers, and a few other instruments that will orbit around Mercury and serve to take pictures and data on the surface of Mercury, as well as the makeup of that surface and Mercury itself. And both of these will, of course, be set to have cooling to be as close to the sun as they are, being near Mercury, and stay in stable orbits once they've been established by the overall Mercury transfer module, as it's dubbed in the part of Bepi Colombo.
You know, when I was looking up kind of what we know so far about Mercury, I did not know this, and a lot of people don't know this. Mercury has ice on it.
Oh, really?
Yes, one at its polar caps, or maybe just one polar cap. I don't know. There's an area that doesn't always see the sun. That's in sort of a deep crater, and there is actually ice that has formed and remains there. It's like negative 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Really, really freaking cold. But if ice can even exist in that harsh a condition, who knows where else? We know Europa, moon of Jupiter, has a sea of salt underneath it that we're eventually going to go explore in more detail. But hey, if something can exist on Mercury, such the shortest distance to our rather warming star, who knows where else it may exist?
Very true.
Indeed.
More reason to have more funding for spacecraft and
Right.
planetary exploration.
Right. I like space exploration. Always fascinates me because I feel like there's only, I do stuff with medical work, and it's cool to learn about the Earth and plants. But it's like I want to know what else we can find out beyond where we live. That's just
There's
cool
so
to
much
me.
we don't know.
I know. There's still so much we don't know about our own planet, the animals that are here.
Very true. Very true indeed.
And real quick, if anyone involved with the Bepi Colombo mission is listening, find out what happened to Mariner 10. All right, everybody wants to know.
We miss Mariner 10.
Yeah, it was the last of the Mariner project, and we don't know where. We don't have the decency to know where it went.
You gotta have some closure.
We'll give it a 21 spectrometer salute or something.
It's like getting a text message breakup or something.
Right.
Get ghosted, and you don't know where that person that you spent so much time getting to know is gone to.
Well, I knew we were not going to have time for these other two things I had wrote down, but I wanted to get to the weed and Bepi Colombo because they're more recent.
So we'll save them for next week.
Yeah, I'm not even going to tell you what they are. I'm just going to save them.
Surprise!
It's going to be a surprise. The Galileo thing, I kept talking about it, but not this time. I'm not even going to mention it.
Not anymore.
Right. So, I think I covered everything I wanted to do. Do you have anything else to add?
No.
I
just got to come up with a title.
I just want to briefly rant because anytime I went to Chipotle for dinner,
okay,
and anytime I go to a place where you order and they, assemble your food in front of you, like an assembly line. This is like you go to a sandwich place or wherever. There's always one or two people in front of me who are ordering for a group of 8 people, even though they're one person. And Chipotle, there were only 2 people ahead of me, and both of them made 4 damn orders, and all 4 of those for each person were really damn complicated. And mine was so easy. It's I wish I could just cut in front of them. I don't know why. I don't know what it is about me that attracts these people to come there and waste all my time ordering for multiple people who couldn't be bothered to go and order their own dang food.
How dare we have first world problems?
God. All right.
Damn you, Chipotle, and your reasonable burritos.
So titled.
In any event.
High quality gravity assists.
I don't know that we can really go any other way aside from titling this podcast as High Quality Bepi Colombo. Because seriously, Bepi Colombo is the best name for a spacecraft ever.
When I saw the name of it, I'm like, what?
That was my initial reaction too. Was what? Who are they sending into space?
Yeah, not
Bepi
anyone.
Colombo.
I forgot who discovered Mercury, or if they have some kind of spacecraft named after them. But I guess they don't matter enough to have this one named after them. So congratulations to you, Bepi.
You can't do better than Bepi Colombo.
All right.
It's the Bepi Colombo.
I just imagine he talks like
authority on the Mercury.
Just imagine he would talk like Tony Montana.
I would expect nothing less from a man whose nickname is Bepi.
Let me tell you something, Mercury. I want to fly by you 6 times before I finally lay my foot down on your ass.
Say hello to my little friend.
And with that, we're going to end the podcast.
Okay.
I am Bepi Colombo.
Goodbye.
And that is Juan. But in actuality, I'm Nick. And that's John.
And this is High Quality Podcast Action. We'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you.